The cypress trunks emerged from the murky water like the outstretched arms of submerged titans, their trunks black and slick, their gray moss draped in mourning veils. I had been traveling for hours along ever-narrowing lanes, the pavement surrendering to crushed oyster shells and compacted earth until I finally spotted the faded board, Perito, Pop, 247, a mercy on the marsh. The atmosphere struck me first when I climbed out of the vehicle. It was dense, almost viscous, laden with the rival scents of gardenia blooms, and something deeper, something ancient, like the corruption at the base of stagnant pools. The dampness enveloped me like a soaked cloth, and I could feel my shirt beginning to adhere to my skin in moments. My grandfather's dwelling stood at the end of a brief dirt trail, elevated on pillars like every structure here. It was a monument to endurance. Cypress planks weathered to silver gray, a drooping veranda with ornate latticework, shutters that had once been emerald, but now bore coats of flaking pigment like scales. The roof was corrugated iron, blotched with corrosion, and I could see where lichen had started its gradual conquest of the northern slope. It was flawless. After 3 years of urban klaxons, horns, and the relentless press of humanity, this seclusion felt like redemption. My grandfather, Elias Thibodeau, had resided here his whole existence, scarcely departing Perito except for rare provision trips. When the attorney phoned to inform me I had inherited the place, I was already plotting my flight from the metropolis. This was destiny. I had believed a signal. I should have heeded the village's name more closely. Perito, forgotten. The interior of the house carried the aroma of aged timber and generations of pipe smoke. Dust motes danced in the afternoon rays that seeped through discolored drapes. The furnishings were sparse yet sturdy. A battered leather recliner, a dining table with mismatched seats, a bedstead that groaned when I tried it. In the kitchen, I discovered jars of jams dated 3 years prior, their hues still impossibly vivid. I was standing on the rear veranda, gazing at the bayou's inky surface and attempting to distinguish logs from gators when I heard the rap at the entrance. The lady on my veranda was perhaps 60, with iron gray hair tied in a knot and a countenance that exuded warmth. She wore a floral pattern frock and clutched a covered platter that still steamed. "You must be Mark," she declared, her tone sweet and syrupy. "I'm B. Miller, just 2 dwellings over. Spotted you arriving and figured you'd welcome a decent greeting." She pushed the platter toward me. "Crawfish étouffée, your grandfather's favorite." "That is extraordinarily generous," I replied, accepting the dish. The fragrance was intoxicating. Butter, seasonings, and shellfish that made my stomach rumble. "Thank you, Mrs. Miller." "B, please." Her grin broadened, but her gaze scrutinized me with an intensity that felt intrusive. "You're from the city, aren't you? I can always spot it. You carry that tense look, all coiled up. Well, Perito will loosen you soon enough. We take things slower here. Life's too brief to hurry." She let herself inside, bustling past me to place the étouffée on the counter. "Now you'll need to learn about the hamlet, won't you? We're a close community. Everyone watches out for everyone else. That's how we've endured out here for so long." She was rummaging through my cupboards as she spoke, clucking at their bareness. "Goodness, you'll need provisions. The mercantile is run by the Fontaine twins. Can't tell them apart to save my soul. They open at 7, close at 7, shut on Sundays naturally." "Naturally," I echoed, rather overwhelmed by her vigor. "And you'll want to meet Mayor LeBlanc, splendid fellow. Truly, he keeps everything flowing like honey around here." She spun to face me, her expression turning grave. "He'll drop by, I reckon, tonight most likely, to greet you properly and clarify matters." Clarify matters. Her smile reappeared, but it failed to reach her eyes. "Just some local traditions, darling. Nothing to fret over. Now tell me, what drew you to Perito? Beyond the inheritance, I mean. A young man like you could be anywhere." The inquiries kept coming, probing softly yet insistently. Where had I been employed? Did I have kin? A sweetheart? What were my intentions? Each response appeared to satisfy her, yet I couldn't shake the sensation I was being assessed, weighed against some unseen measure. When she finally departed, vowing to check on me tomorrow, I felt drained in a way unrelated to the journey. I spent the remainder of the afternoon surveying the settlement. Perito was tiny, little more than one central lane with homes scattered about it like grains flung by a careless sower. The buildings were uniform, lifted houses, tin roofs, louvered windows. The paint shades varied wildly, bright lemons, profound indigos, faded crimsons, but everything possessed that same worn, cherished quality. The residents were amicable to the point of insistence. Everyone waved, everyone beamed, everyone wished to know my identity, and welcomed me with an eagerness that felt rehearsed. But what struck me most were the minor occurrences I observed in just that initial hour. A girl, no older than 7, was playing near the bayou's rim when she let out a yelp of joy. She had pried open an oyster on a stone. Inside, cradled in the meat, lay a flawless pearl the size of a shooter marble. Her mother chuckled, unsurprised, and pocketed it nonchalantly, as though discovering pearls was as ordinary as finding seashells. At the mercantile, I watched B. Miller settle her bill. As the Fontaine brother, I couldn't distinguish which, tallied her items, the radio behind the counter declared a winner for some giveaway. B's phone buzzed. She answered, laughed, and evidently won $200. She accepted the tidings with the same casual poise as the pearl-discovering child's mother. Walking back toward my dwelling, I noticed storm clouds assembling to the west, dark and pregnant with rain. The air held that charged pre-storm quality, but as the clouds neared Perito, they appeared to divide, parting around the village like liquid around a boulder. The rain fell in sheets on either side of us, and far off I could see lightning lancing the marsh. But above Perito, the sky stayed merely overcast, almost shielding. Lovely, isn't it? I turned to find a gentleman standing beside me. He was in his 50s, tall and impeccably attired despite the damp, pressed khakis, a crisp white shirt, and a smile fit for a ballot poster. His hair was silver at the temples, and his eyes were a pale blue that seemed to pierce straight through me. Mayor LeBlanc, he announced, offering his hand. Clarence LeBlanc. I've been meaning to stop by. Welcome you to our little haven. His grip was solid, his palm dry despite the moisture. His voice had a quality like mature bourbon, smooth, warm, with a faint bite beneath. I was just admiring the weather, I said, or the absence of it. We're favored, he replied simply, as if that settled everything. Perito has always been favored. The fishing's abundant, the gardens flourish, and the weather knows to spare us. It's been thus longer than anyone recalls. That's remarkable fortune. Fortune? He seemed to savor the term, turning it over on his tongue. Sure, we can call it that. Come, let's speak on your veranda. I have something to explain, and it's best done properly. We sat in my grandfather's rocking chairs, mine squeaking, his motionless, with glasses of iced tea he had brought in a jug. The sun was starting to sink, bathing the bayou in hues of gold and copper. Your grandfather was a fine man, LeBlanc began. Quiet, kept to himself, but he comprehended Perito. He grasped what it means to belong to a place like ours. He sipped his tea, his gaze never leaving mine. We have a custom here, Mark. A peculiarity, you might say. Some call it superstition. Others say it's old ways clinging on, but everyone observes it without fail. What sort of custom? We call it the lament, he said, his voice lowering slightly. Every night between 2 and 2:20 in the morning, something paces through Perito down the main lane from one end to the other. It emits a sound, a crying, wailing sound, hence the name. I waited for the joke, the disclosure that this was some initiation for newcomers. It never came. The custom is straightforward, he continued. During those 20 minutes, you remain in your bedroom. You do not peer outside. You do not utter a sound, not a floorboard groan, not a murmured syllable, nothing. You become as still and quiet as the tomb. You're serious, deadly so. His smile had vanished, replaced by something harder, colder. I know how it sounds to metropolitan ears, but this is how we've always done it, and this is how we will keep doing it. The tranquility and prosperity of Perito depend on universal adherence, and if someone fails to comply, the temperatures seem to plummet despite the lingering warmth. LeBlanc set his glass down carefully, the ice clinking against the sides. Then they are no longer part of our tranquility, he murmured softly, and Perito safeguards its own, Mark. We've endured here for generations because we understand the community comes first. Always. Those who jeopardize our way of life. He let the sentence hang, but the implication lingered in the humid air like haze. The peace of Perito is everything, son, he said, rising. His shadow stretched long across the veranda. We protect our own, and we expect you to do likewise. Violate the rules, and you are no longer one of us. For a fleeting instant, the cordial mask slipped. I glimpsed something in his eyes. Not quite viciousness, but an utter, unshakable determination. This was a man who would do anything required to preserve what was his. Then the smile returned, warm and paternal. But you're a clever young man. Your grandfather never gave trouble. I'm certain you won't either. Rest well, Mark, and remember, 2 to 2:20, quiet as the grave. He left me there as the sun slipped beneath the tree line, and I sat in the deepening gloom attempting to absorb what I had just heard. I should have departed then, loaded my car and driven through the night until Peridot was merely another bizarre tale to recount at gatherings. But something anchored me, perhaps stubbornness, perhaps intrigue, or perhaps the house itself with its groaning planks and scent of pipe tobacco that reminded me of a grandfather I had scarcely known. I ate bees étouffées. It was the finest thing I had ever tasted and attempted to distract myself with unpacking, but my eyes kept drifting to the clock. 8:47 p.m., 10:23 p.m., 11:56 p.m. At 1:30 a.m., I withdrew to what LeBlanc had termed my room. The bedroom was compact, the closet smaller, and I sat on the floor with my back to the wall, surrounded by my grandfather's old garments that still carried the faint aroma of tobacco and bay rum. The minutes dragged. I extinguished all lights. My phone was muted. I scarcely dared breathe. At precisely 2 a.m., I heard it. The sound began far off, from the northern edge of town. It was a sobbing, but not the soft weeping of sorrow. This was raw, visceral, a noise of such profound anguish that it seemed to creep beneath my skin and lodge in my marrow. It was the sound of something that had forgotten humanity, but recalled suffering. The sobbing grew nearer. I could hear it progressing down the main lane, and I realized with a sickening jolt that it would pass directly before my house. The sound was not constant. It would surge and ebb like a tide, punctuated by awful, moist gasps that turned my stomach. Every instinct screamed at me to look, to witness what produced that noise. But LeBlanc's warning resounded in my mind, and beneath the curiosity lay a primal terror that knew, absolutely knew, that looking meant death. The sobbing reached my house. The floorboards in the living room groaned as though something tested the veranda. The sound seemed to fill the entire world, pressing against the walls, leaking through the cracks. I clamped my hands over my ears, yet I could still hear it, still feel it resonating in my chest. Time halted, stretched, lost meaning. And then, at exactly 2:20 a.m., it ceased. The silence that followed was so total, so profound, that for a moment I believed I had gone deaf. No crickets, no frogs, no night birds, just silence, heavy as a held breath. Slowly, cautiously, I unfolded from my closet position. My limbs were numb, my hands trembling. I made my way to the bed and collapsed, staring at the ceiling, my heart still pounding. What in hell was that? And why, despite the dread still coursing through my veins, did I desperately, perilously crave to know? I did not sleep after that first night. How could I? Even after the lament ceased, after that absolute silence settled over Peridot like a funeral pall, I lay in bed staring upward, my heart still hammering against my ribs. The sound had burrowed into my skull, and I could still sense it, that raw, visceral despair vibrating in my chest like a second pulse. When dawn finally arrived, spilling pale light through the faded curtains, I felt hollow, depleted, but beneath the fear, that perilous curiosity coiled like something alive, something I could not fully suppress no matter how fiercely I tried. The second day was flawless, just like the first. The sun rose warm and golden over the marsh, dispelling the early mist. Birds trilled in the cypress branches. Life proceeded as though nothing had occurred, as though the entire village had not spent 20 minutes paralyzed in dread mere hours earlier. I watched from my rear veranda as an elderly man hauled a net from the water. It came up so laden with catfish and bass that 2 others had to assist him. They were laughing, their voices carrying across the calm water as if this were utterly ordinary. The nets were always brimming, the favor at work. I brewed coffee, strong, bitter, from the ancient grounds in my grandfather's cupboard and tried to persuade myself to depart, to load the car, to drive until Peridot was merely an odd anecdote to share over cocktails, something to chuckle about with drinks. But I did not move. Could not move. The house smelled of pipe tobacco and aged timber, and in the morning light it felt secure, familiar, and that perilous curiosity was a barb in my chest, tugging me deeper into waters I did not comprehend. B. Miller arrived around noon with a casserole, her approach announced by the creak of the veranda steps. She said nothing of the lament. No one did. It was as though those 20 minutes between 2 and 2:20 did not exist in Peridot's daylight realm. as if we all shared a collective amnesia that reset with each sunrise. "You appear weary, dear," she said, placing the dish on my counter with that warm, intrusive smile that never quite reached her eyes. First few nights in a new home are always difficult. Takes time to adapt to new rhythms. You'll settle soon. "Of course," I said, watching her eyes as they inventoried my house. The coffee mugs piled in the sink, the blanket I had dragged from the closet and left rumpled on the sofa, the fact that my bedroom door stood ajar when it clearly should have been shut. "The key is routine," she went on, moving through my kitchen as if it were hers, opening cabinets, reorganizing my grandfather's old crockery. "We all have our small habits here. I knit from 9 to 10 every evening without fail. Helps me unwind before sleep, keeps the mind occupied. You should find something too, something to occupy your thoughts during those evening hours. Reading perhaps, or puzzles. Your grandfather used to carve, made little birds from cypress. Never quite completed any, but the act was what counted. It was counsel wrapped in threat. Do not dwell on it. Do not question it. Simply obey. Keep your mind busy until it is time to cower." She departed after extracting a vow that I would attend Sunday worship at the small white chapel on the corner. I watched her walk down the dirt path to the lane, her floral dress swaying, and I noticed something I had overlooked before. Every house on the street, every single one, had thick drapes, and not merely on the front windows. Every window was shrouded in heavy cloth that blocked all light. And as I looked closer, I realized something else that twisted my gut. The windows were not just covered, they were painted sealed. Layers upon layers of paint fused them shut, as though the houses themselves were bastions designed not to keep things out, but to keep occupants in. That afternoon, I examined the house more thoroughly, driven by a need to understand the architecture of dread. The bathroom window, painted sealed, the sash fused with what appeared decades of accumulated pigment. The bedroom windows, same. I tried to force one open with a butter knife, scraping at the paint, but it had petrified over half a century or more. My grandfather had lived here his whole life, and apparently he had never once needed to open a window, to admit fresh air, to have an exit. The bedroom door was stranger still, and more disturbing the longer I studied it. It had a lock, but only on the exterior. A simple sliding bolt that could imprison someone inside, but offered no safeguard to the sleeper. It was a design choice that chilled my skin, made me wonder what sort of village built homes specifically to incarcerate their residents. Perito was not merely built around the lament. It was built for it. Every architectural decision, every sealed window and reversed lock served one purpose, guaranteeing obedience during those 20 minutes of terror. I spent the rest of that second day wandering the settlement, observing. The mercantile was busy, the Fontaine brothers restocking shelves with goods that seemed to materialize from nowhere, for I had seen no delivery vans. A woman discovered a $20 bill tucked in her purse lining and laughed as though she had won a jackpot. A child's lemonade stand was patronized by every passerby, each paying far more than asked. The favors were constant, small and steady, a continual trickle of good fortune that kept everyone compliant. But I also noticed the timepieces. Every adult I passed checked their watch or phone obsessively. Time was an obsession here. They needed to know precisely when sunset would arrive, precisely how many hours until 2 a.m., precisely how long until they must hide again. That second night, I obeyed again. I retreated to the closet at 1:45 a.m., surrounded by my grandfather's clothes that still smelled of tobacco and bay rum, and waited. The lament came at exactly 2. That horrible sound that was neither fully human nor fully beast, like something that had forgotten one but remembered suffering as the other. It lasted precisely 20 minutes, and when it ended, I sat in the darkness, trembling, the barb of curiosity digging deeper, pulling harder. The third day broke hot and oppressive, the air so thick I could scarcely breathe. I had slept perhaps a few scattered hours over 3 nights, and I could feel it in my marrow, that loose, unmoored sensation where reality softens at the edges and poor choices begin to seem rational. I drank coffee until my hands shook. Cup after cup of the bitter sludge brewed from my grandfather's ancient stash. I paced the house, wearing a groove between kitchen and living room. I stood on the veranda and watched the village pursue its favored existence. And the wrongness of it all pressed against my skull like a migraine gathering behind my eyes. Children played in the lane, their laughter shrill. Bee tended her garden, which had miraculously recovered from a mysterious overnight blight and now bloomed with impossible lushness. The mayor's car, a pristine vintage Cadillac that had no business running so flawlessly in this damp, cruised past my house twice, slowly, and each time I saw him glance at my windows, checking, ensuring I remained, still compliant. By evening, I was unraveling. The coffee had me jittery and paranoid. I kept catching movement in my peripheral vision, shadows that should not exist in the fading light. The sun sank, painting the bayou in shades of amber and blood, and I sat in the leather recliner, drinking cup after cup, watching the wall clock tick forward with excruciating slowness. The mayor's warning echoed in my head, had echoed there for 3 days. Break the rules and you are no longer one of us. It sounded less like a threat now, and more like a dare. What was so terrible about looking? What were they so desperate to conceal? The curiosity had grown fangs, had become something I could no longer ignore. At 1:30 a.m., I did not go to the closet. I sat in the darkened living room, curtains drawn but not cowering, my heart thundering with a blend of terror and something almost like exhilaration. The caffeine had my nerves singing, electricity coursing through my veins. Sleep deprivation had disabled the part of my brain that recognized this was catastrophically foolish, had switched off the part that grasped consequences. I waited, and time turned to molasses. At 1:58 a.m., I heard it start, distant from the northern end of town, but this time it sounded different, closer, more intentional. The lament was not the steady procession of prior nights. This time it paused, resumed, as though the thing producing that sound was moving slower, lingering at certain homes, as if it were seeking. The sobbing grew louder, and I realized with a lurching dread that it had halted directly outside my gate, at the edge of my yard. The sound swelled, filling the night, pressing against the house walls. It was so near I could hear the wet, rasping quality of it, could hear what almost sounded like breathing between the sobs, great heaving inhalations that rattled like wind through a hollow trunk. It was not moving on. It was waiting for me. The burning need to know overwhelmed everything else. Fear, warnings, the common sense that screamed at me to flee to the closet and hide like an obedient citizen of Perito. My legs moved of their own accord, carrying me to the front window. My hand reached for the heavy drape, fingers shaking. I told myself I would look for only a second, just a sliver, just enough to glimpse what everyone feared so deeply, what held an entire village in thrall. I parted the edge of the curtain, creating a gap no wider than my eye, and I saw it. The thing standing at my gate was tall, impossibly tall, at least 8 feet, with limbs too elongated and joints that bent at impossible angles where humans possessed none. Its skin was not skin, but something resembling damp, polished cypress bark, dark and glistening in the moonlight, textured like wood yet moving like flesh. It was gaunt, ribs visible through the bark flesh, each outlined in stark relief, and its proportions were all wrong. Arms dangling past its knees, fingers tapering to sharp points rather than nails, legs that seemed to fold inward. But it was the face that shattered me, that destroyed whatever fragile bravery I had mustered. It was not weeping. Its mouth gaped open, jaw unhinged like a serpent's, distended and cavernous. And the sound, that horrible guttural sobbing, emanated from somewhere deep within its torso, resonating from a hollow that should not exist. The mouth did not move. The sound simply poured forth, endless and raw. The mechanical lament of something that imitated human grief without comprehending it. Its eyes were the worst. They glowed a sickly yellow like sulfur, like infection. And they were scanning the houses methodically, moving from window to window, searching for any flicker of motion, any gap in a curtain, any sign of life. As I watched, frozen in horror, it took a lurching step forward, and I saw how it moved, not walking, but dragging itself with those long arms like crutches while its legs buckled and straightened in a grotesque mockery of human gait. It moved past my house, and for one desperate, foolish moment, I thought I was safe. I had seen it, and it had not seen me. I had sated my curiosity and lived. I began to lower the curtain, to retreat to the closet and pretend this had never happened. Then its head swiveled. Not its body, just its head. A complete 180-degree turn on its neck with a sound like wet timber splintering, like snapping branches. One glowing yellow eye fixed directly on the slit in my curtain, directly on me. The sobbing ceased instantly. The silence was worse than the noise. Its mouth, that terrible dangling maw, stretched further, pulling back and upward into what might have been a grin, a rictus that revealed no teeth, only a dark, endless void leading downward into its chest. And then it screamed. The sound was torment. Ice picks driven into my eardrums, my sinuses, my brain. I staggered backward, hands flying to my ears, yet I could still hear it, still feel it vibrating in my bones, in my teeth, behind my eyes. The front veranda groaned under sudden weight. The entire house shuddered, and I heard the supporting pillars creak, heard the stilts that held the house above the sodden ground protest. Shadows writhed across the walls, moving independently of any light source. And then beams of yellow light, the color of its eyes, began slicing through the cracks in the walls, through the gaps in the doorframe, beneath the door, searching, seeking, hunting. The door began to splinter. I heard the timber cracking, heard something on the other side clawing, ripping at the frame with impossible force. I ran. Blind panic propelled me through the house. I needed a weapon, needed something, anything. My hand closed around the first heavy object I found. My grandfather's old cast-iron skillet hanging by the stove. It was solid, real, and in my sleep-deprived, terror-soaked mind, it seemed salvation. But even through the panic, some small, rational part of me knew I could not fight that thing, could not harm it. The door was coming apart, splinters flying. The yellow light was everywhere, painting the walls jaundiced. I could hear it now on the veranda, and the sound it made was no longer the lament but something worse, a wet, eager breathing. The sound of anticipation. I did not hurl the skillet at the door. Some deep survival instinct told me that would be futile. Instead, I flung it away from the house, out the back into the dark marsh beyond. It crashed through the oleander and struck the water with a splash that seemed deafening in the night. The assault stopped instantly. The yellow light vanished as though a switch had been thrown. The pressure on the door ceased and I heard it. Those lurching, dragging footsteps moving away from my house, around the side, toward the bayou, toward the sound of the splash. I collapsed against the kitchen wall, gasping, my entire body shaking so violently, my teeth chattered. Through the shattered door, I could see the main lane was empty. The thing was gone, drawn off by the noise, distracted like a beast. But I knew the way one knows in nightmares that it was not truly gone. It had seen me. It knew where I was now. It had marked me, and would return. Dawn came, but brought no solace. I sat against the kitchen wall where I had fallen, my body aching, my ears still ringing from that scream. The broken front door hung askew on its hinges, and through the gap, I could see the main lane bathed in pale morning light. Something was amiss. The light looked ill somehow, thin and watery, as though the sun itself struggled to shine on Perito. I forced myself upright, legs trembling, and walked to the rear veranda. The bayou stretched before me, and what I saw turned my stomach. Dead fish floated on the surface, dozens, their white bellies turned skyward. The water itself appeared darker, stagnant, and a stench rose from it. Not the usual organic rot of the swamp, but something worse, something spoiled and ancient and deliberately malevolent. B. Miller's garden, which yesterday had bloomed with impossible vibrancy, was withered. The flowers drooped, limp and brown. The vegetables shriveled on their vines. I watched her emerge from her house, saw her halt at the edge of her garden, her hand rising to her mouth. When she turned toward my dwelling, her face was transformed. The warm, grandmotherly kindness was gone, replaced by something cold and utterly merciless. Our eyes met across the distance. She did not wave. She simply stared. And in that stare, I saw my death. I retreated inside and tried to think. The favors were broken. The entity had marked me, and somehow that had severed whatever supernatural compact kept Perito prosperous. The village would know. They would all know by now that someone had violated the rules, and they would know precisely who. I was still trying to process this when I heard the car, that pristine Cadillac pulling up to my ruined gate. Mayor LeBlanc stepped out, and there was nothing left of the charming politician. He climbed my veranda steps, his footfalls heavy and deliberate, and stood in the doorway without invitation. "You damned idiot," he said, his voice flat and icy. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" I did not answer. Could not answer. My throat was too tight. "Look outside, Mark. Look at what your curiosity has cost us." He gestured toward the bayou. 3 generations of prosperity gone in a single night because you couldn't follow one simple rule. The nets came up empty this morning. Empty. Jesse Crawford's truck, which has run perfectly for 15 years, won't start. My wife's arthritis is back. The favors are broken. I don't care what you meant. His pale blue eyes were chips of ice. You looked. You invited its attention. And now you've reminded it that the pact can be broken, that there are other ways to feed. You've endangered every soul in this village. He stepped closer, and I saw his hand resting on his belt near where I assumed a pistol was holstered. You have until sundown to leave, he said quietly. Pack your car and drive away and never return. That is the mercy we are offering you, because if you're still here when night falls. He let the threat hang, but it was clear. Or we will make you a permanent part of our peace. Do you understand me? I nodded, unable to trust my voice. He left, and I stood in the wreckage of my grandfather's house, my mind racing. Leave. I should leave. Pack the car. Drive until Perito was just a nightmare in my rearview mirror. But even as I thought it, I knew I could not. The entity had seen me. It knew me now. And something told me that departing Perito would not matter. It would follow. It would find me. I needed answers. I needed to understand what I faced. I tore through the house, searching with frantic purpose. My grandfather had lived here his entire life. He had understood something about the curse, about the entity. There had to be something, some clue, some defense I could use. The writing desk sat in the corner of the living room, old cypress scarred with decades of use. I had noticed it before, but never truly examined it. Now I ran my hands over every surface, pressing, probing, and there, a slight yield in the bottom of the main drawer. I removed the drawer entirely and found it. A false bottom, cleverly concealed, the seam nearly invisible. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and fragile. The title was written in my grandfather's precise hand, La Llorosa, Notes on a Bargain. I opened it with trembling fingers and began to read. The first entry was dated 50 years ago. My grandfather's voice came through clearly in the neat script. I have lived in Perito my entire life, and I have participated in its deception, but I can no longer remain ignorant of the truth. What walks our streets at night is not a ghost, not a legend, but something primordial, a spirit of the swamp, older than the village, older than memory. I flipped through pages, my eyes scanning desperately. The journal was part research, part confession. My grandfather had spent decades studying the entity, documenting its patterns, its nature, its appetites. It feeds on potential and memory. One entry read, "When it takes someone, they are erased completely, not merely killed, but unmade. The village forgets they ever existed. Reality rewrites itself around their absence. This is the true horror of La Llorosa, not death, but non-existence." Another entry written in a shaking hand. "The favors are not gifts. They are byproducts of its feeding. The residue of stolen potential redistributed among us. We prosper because others cease to be. We are complicit in a cycle of sacrifice, and we have made our peace with it because the alternative is to face what we truly are." But it was the later entries that made my hands shake. My grandfather had discovered rituals, wards, methods to repel the entity. He had gathered them from old sources, from Cajun folklore, from traditions that predated Perito itself, salt mixed with rust and bayou mud. I read aloud, my voice barely a whisper. Applied to the thresholds, it creates a barrier against the spirit touched. I raced to the kitchen, found an old container of salt. Rust. There was a corroded iron pan beneath the sink. I scraped the rust into a bowl, mixed it with salt and mud from the yard, working with frantic speed. The sun was moving across the sky. I had hours, not days. The journal described ward stones, river quartz wrapped in Spanish moss charged beneath the full moon. I found a cache of them in the false bottom of the desk, already prepared, as though my grandfather had been waiting for this moment. Had he known? Had he suspected I would be the one to shatter the pattern? The entity is bound by rules as much as we are, another entry stated. It cannot enter a properly warded space, but the wards must be maintained, renewed. Once you are marked, it will not stop. It will come every night until it has you, or until the pact is reset. The pact is reset. Those words leapt out at me. I flipped frantically through the remaining pages, searching for more, but the final page was torn away, the ragged edge taunting me. I spent the rest of the day preparing. I smeared the salt mixture across every threshold, doors, windows, even the gaps in the walls. I placed the ward stones at the corners of each room, whispering the words my grandfather had transcribed, hoping I pronounced them correctly. The house began to feel different, the air thickening as though the protections created their own density. The sun set. I watched it through the broken door, that massive red orb sinking beneath the tree line, and felt my heart hammering. I had stayed. I had not left. And now the village would know. I waited in the living room, the journal open on my lap, reading and rereading my grandfather's notes as darkness fell. The ward stones glowed faintly, a soft blue light that pulsed like a heartbeat. The protection was active. At 2:09 a.m., the lament began, but this time it was different. The sound was focused, concentrated. It was not moving down the main lane in its usual pattern. It was coming straight for my house, unwavering, purposeful. The temperature plummeted. My breath misted in the air despite the humidity. And then I saw it, a shadow seeping beneath the front door, spreading across the floor like spilled oil. The ward stones flared brighter, and the shadow recoiled, hissing, but it did not leave. It probed the edges of the room, testing the protection, seeking weaknesses. I sat frozen, clutching the journal, watching the shadow writhe and twist against the barriers. Then I saw its face in the reflection of the water glass on the table beside me. Distorted and horrible, the entity's face appeared. That bark-like skin, those yellow eyes, that hanging jaw, but stretched, elongated, as though the reflection itself were melting. It was looking at me through the glass, bypassing the physical wards by using reflection as a gateway. The house groaned, not the creaking of old wood, but a sound of strain, as though the entire structure were being squeezed from all sides. The shadows deepened in the corners, and in them I saw movement, shapes that were not quite there. Phantoms of people who had been erased, their potential absorbed and redistributed. The ward stones held, but barely. Cracks appeared in the walls. The floor buckled. The house felt as though it were drowning in malice, sinking into an ocean of hunger and ancient rage. I opened the journal again, desperate for answers, for some clue about the resetting ritual my grandfather had mentioned. And there, tucked into the back cover where I had not thought to look, I found it. The torn final page, carefully preserved, explaining everything I would need to survive. But surviving would demand one more night in this house of horrors, one more confrontation with the thing that would not stop until it had unmade me completely. The weeping swelled, filling every crack and corner, and I held the journal to my chest like a shield, praying my grandfather's protections would hold until dawn. The day passed in a haze of exhaustion and preparation. I read and reread the torn final page until the words blurred. The ritual of the still water, my grandfather had written in his careful script. A resetting of the bargain. Not a breaking, but a pause. 5 years of silence. 5 years for the village to remember what it means to live without the favors and without the terror. The instructions were precise. At the old dock at the edge of the swamp, at the exact moment the lament ceased, 2:20 a.m., I had to arrange the ward stones in a circle and speak the words written in the margin. The entity would be drawn to me, but the ritual, if performed correctly, would force it into dormancy. The pact would reset to 0. Perito would lose its supernatural luck, but it would also lose its nightly horror. I gathered the ward stones, counting them obsessively. 12. I needed 12. I found them all, each wrapped in Spanish moss my grandfather had preserved in a sealed jar. I packed the journal, the stones, a flashlight, and nothing else. If this worked, I would not return to this house. As the sun began its descent, painting the bayou in shades of blood and gold, I heard them coming. At first just footsteps, then voices, low murmurs that grew louder as more joined. I looked out the back window and felt my blood freeze. The entire village was assembling before my house. Men, women, even teenagers, all moving in that eerie silence Perito had perfected over generations. They carried tools, rakes, shovels, axes. Some held torches that flickered in the dying light, casting their faces in demonic shadow. Mayor LeBlanc stood at the front, his pristine Cadillac parked across my gate like a barricade. Beside him was B. Miller, her face hard as granite. Behind them, I recognized the Fontaine brothers from the Mercantile. Old Mrs. Crawford, who had always waved so pleasantly. Families with children kept safely in the rear. They were all here, every single resident of Perito, united in purpose. They did not chant or shout. They simply stood there waiting for full darkness. Their silence was more terrifying than any mob's fury. Their message was clear. When night fell, they would come for me. They would drag me from this house and offer me to the entity, and their favors would return. The cycle would continue. I had perhaps an hour until they moved. An hour until full dark, when the supernatural laws of Perito held strongest sway. I went through the house one final time, checking the ward stones I had placed earlier. They still glowed faintly, but the light was weakening. The protections would not survive another night. The entity was learning, adapting, finding paths through the barriers. If I remained here, I would die, or worse, cease to exist, erased from reality like all the others who had broken the rules. The back door was my only option. The mob was concentrated at the front, their attention fixed on the main entrance. If I could slip out the rear into the bayou, I might reach the old dock before they noticed I was gone. I stuffed the journal into my jacket, distributed the ward stones into every pocket, and waited. The sun touched the horizon. The sky bled from gold to red to deep violet. And then, as the last light faded, I heard Mayor LeBlanc's voice ring out across the yard. "Mark Thibodeau, you have made your choice. You chose to stay. You chose to endanger us all. Now we choose to protect ourselves. Come out peacefully, and it will be swift. Force us to come in, and we will ensure you are conscious when she takes you." The front door shuddered under the first blow. An axe, probably. They were not waiting any longer. I ran out the back door, down the rickety steps into the bayou. The water was warm and thick, closing around my legs like oil. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating cypress knees and hanging moss. Behind me, I heard the front door splinter, heard the mobs roar as they realized I had fled. He's running to the bayou. Their footsteps thundered through the house. The lament began. It was early, barely 9 p.m., but the entity knew. It knew I was coming. The sound erupted from everywhere and nowhere, that guttural sobbing that crawled beneath my skin. But this time, it was not the mechanical patrol of previous nights. This was focused, eager hunting. I saw the dock ahead, a skeletal structure of weathered planks reaching into the dark water, and standing at the end of it, illuminated by the sickly yellow glow of its own eyes, was La Llorosa. It was not walking its route. It was not following the rules. It was waiting for me. The scream it unleashed silenced everything. The frogs stopped mid-croak. The insects ceased their drone. Even the water seemed to still. In that terrible silence, I forced my legs to keep moving, to carry me toward the thing that wanted to unmake me. I climbed onto the dock, hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped the ward stones. The entity watched me, head tilted at that impossible angle, mouth hanging open in that eternal silent scream. It did not move. Not yet. It was waiting to see what I would do. I arranged the stones in a circle around me, 12 points like a clock. My grandfather's instructions were burned into my mind. I whispered the words he had written, old words in a tongue I did not know, but that felt heavy on my tongue, as though they drew something from the air itself. Ancient one, spirit-touched, creature of potential and memory. I offer you silence. I offer you rest. I offer you the breaking of your chains and the resetting of your bargain. The entity moved, not its body, but its mouth. That hanging jaw stretched wider, impossibly wide, and the lament became a roar. It lurched forward, those long arms reaching for me, but the ward stones flared bright, blue-white light erupting from each one. The entity recoiled, shrieking, its bark skin smoking where the light touched it. I kept speaking, my voice growing stronger, the words flowing faster. By salt and rust and bayou mud, by river quartz and Spanish moss, by the moon that charges and the water that cleanses, I bind you to silence. 5 years of slumber, 5 years of forgetting. Let the pact reset. Let Perito remember what it means to be mortal. The entity lunged again, and this time its hand passed through the ward circle, the protection buckling under its desperate fury. Its fingers, those sharp, pointed things, scraped across my shoulder, and the pain was like nothing I had ever felt. Not merely physical, but deeper. It was trying to erase me, to reach into my essence and tear me out of existence. I screamed the final words, the culmination of the ritual. By still water and final breath, return to the deep, return to silence, sleep. The dock shook. The water erupted around us. And from somewhere deep in the swamp, a sound rose. Not the lament, but something older, something vast. The entity's scream cut off mid-cry. Its yellow eyes widened, almost seeming to show something like fear. And then a wave of absolute silence exploded outward from the dock. It was not the absence of sound. It was the presence of silence, a tangible force that pressed against my eardrums, filled my lungs, seemed to halt time itself. The entity opened its mouth one final time, let out a roar of pure frustration, and then it was collapsing, folding in on itself, its bark skin dissolving into dark water that poured between the dock's planks and vanished into the bayou. The silence broke. Normal sounds rushed back. Water lapping, wind rustling, my own ragged breathing. The wardstones dimmed and went dark, their purpose fulfilled. I did not wait. I did not look back. I ran through the swamp, away from the dock, away from the voices of the mob calling my name with rage and desperation. I reached my car, parked at the edge of the property, started it with shaking hands, and drove. I drove through the night, through Louisiana, across state lines into Texas. I did not stop for fuel until the sun was fully up, and Perito was 100 miles behind me. Even then, I could not shake the feeling that something followed, watched. 3 days later, I was in a cheap motel in Oklahoma, far from bayou and cypress and the stench of gardenia and decay. The journal lay on the bed beside me, my grandfather's handwriting, a final link to a nightmare I had barely survived. I was safe. The ritual had worked. The entity was dormant, and Peridot would spend the next 5 years learning to live without its favors, and without its curse. I had broken the cycle just as my grandfather had hoped someone would. I should have felt relief, victory. Instead, I felt watched. The television was off, its screen dark and reflective in the dim motel lighting. I caught movement in it and turned to look, just a glance, just to confirm it was my own reflection moving with me. But it was not. In the dark television screen, I saw the motel room reflected behind me. And in that reflection, standing in the corner where the bathroom met the main room, was a tall shape, impossibly tall, impossibly thin, with limbs too long and joints at wrong angles. 2 pinpricks of yellow light opened in the darkness where its face should be. My grandfather had been wrong, or perhaps the journal had been incomplete. The slumber was not for the entity. The 5 years of silence, that was for Perito, for the village, for the pact. But I had performed the ritual. I had touched the entity directly, and now it was bound to me. It was here. It would always be here, and it would not stop until it had unmade me completely. I closed my eyes, but when I opened them, the yellow lights were still there, patient and eternal, waiting in the reflection that showed a truth I could not escape. The lament began again, soft and close, coming from inside the walls.